Were conspiracy theorists right about COVID vaccines? Who is right in this debate? What does the science say? And why is Jordan Peterson so angry? All of these questions and more will be answered in this video. Hey, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another debunking video. So recently, the streamer Destiny and Jordan Peterson had a debate about lots of different topics. In case you don't know who these people are, Destiny is a streamer who debates topics like politics, science, philosophy, and whatnot. And Jordan Peterson is a Canadian psychologist who is also an author and a media commentator. I don't know too much about either of them, to be honest, but I have had very brief chats with Destiny. He seems like a cool guy. And I just know that Jordan Peterson is really well known because he's really angry at pronouns. So yeah, I'm not a fan of him. Full disclosure going into this. I'll probably be a little biased. But I decided to do this video because I saw a lot of clips floating around on the internet of them talking about COVID vaccines and what happened during the COVID pandemic. And I saw Jordan Peterson make some very interesting claims, and I saw Destiny doing a pretty good job of correcting him and pushing back, but I figure I'm the scientist here, so maybe I can add a little bit more. And also, I want to just see the whole section, because, man, the clips I saw were pretty wild. Anyway, I have not seen these sections before, so let's get into it.
So we can pretend now that the conservative argument was just compulsory vaccines are bad because they infringe on my freedom. That wasn't the conservative argument. The conservative argument was that mass deaths were going to happen, mass side effects were going to happen. There was going to be all this corruption and stuff related to vaccine distribution, to the crazier theories for microchips and blah, blah, blah. None of that came true.
Okay, so yeah, Destiny's right there. I think that a lot of people who were against COVID vaccines weren't doing it just because they disagreed with mandates. They were also doing it because they had some fear that they thought was rooted in some scientific principle. And in almost every case, that was not true. That's why this topic of mandates and stuff is pretty tired, because it's intellectually lazy to say that just because the government mandated it, I don't want it. There's usually some other reason, and that's always what I'm interested in when I talk to people about this. What is the reason they didn't want to get COVID vaccines? What is the reason that they thought they were going to be harmed in some way? How did they come to that conclusion, and what sources did they use? And was that a informed decision, or were they misinformed into making that decision? But let's see what Jordan Peterson says.
What do you mean none of it? What do you make of the excess deaths?
There are, for related to vaccines, there are almost none. The mRNA vaccines have been administered related to vaccines.
We don't know. No.
We absolutely know. We absolutely. This is like settled science.
What do we know
in terms of vaccine related?
No. That's not my question. Excess deaths in Europe are up about 20%, and they have been since the end of the COVID pandemic.
Sounds really high to me. 20%?
Go look.
I'll check afterwards.
Okay, we can go look, Jordan. So if we actually look at the data, we see that if you categorize countries by most vaccinated to least vaccinated, and also organize them by highest excess deaths per capita since 2021, when the vaccines rolled out, and lowest excess deaths per capita since 2021, you see that the highest vaccinated countries in Europe had the lowest amounts of excess deaths. Meanwhile, the least vaccinated countries in Europe had the highest rates of excess deaths. So right there, that doesn't really support the idea that vaccines are causing excess deaths. But we can also look deeper and do studies to ask whether COVID vaccines are killing people on a population level such that they would cause excess deaths? And the answer is no. When you compare groups of unvaccinated versus vaccinated people and just measure all-cause mortality, so you're measuring who died from all causes and compare the two groups, you see that the vaccinated have lower rates of excess deaths. And if you look at all-cause mortality excluding COVID, then you see that the rates are practically equal. This means that the vaccines just don't increase your chance of dying. It's that simple. So what is causing the excess death? It's COVID. You can look at any European country and you see that spikes in excess deaths almost always track with confirmed COVID hospitalizations and confirmed COVID deaths.
Are you implying that you think it's because of vaccines?
I'm not implying anything. I'm saying what the excess deaths are.
But what is your take on what's causing it?
One relatively straightforward hypothesis is that it's a consequence of the disruption of the healthcare system, the staving off of cancer treatment, etc., the increase in depression, anxiety, suicidality, and alcoholism that was a consequence of the lockdowns, the economic disruption. And there's plenty of reason to believe that some of that is the case.
Yeah, sure, that can definitely be a factor. I mean, at least in the UK, there was a huge burden on the healthcare system and the NHS, inhibited emergency responders from responding promptly to emergencies, and thus more people died of medical emergencies when that otherwise wouldn't normally happen. But this happened only in the UK because the UK was experiencing that problem. It didn't happen all over Europe all at once, which you would expect something like that to happen if it was a vaccine causing all this death, because everybody got vaccinated mostly all at once. So you would expect the health problems to show up everywhere, mostly all at once. But that's not what we see. And just to continue on his point about lockdowns, that is a valid criticism of the lockdowns, the way they were used by governments, not just in Europe, but elsewhere too. The whole point of lockdowns was for us to do a hard lockdown for just a couple of weeks so that healthcare systems and the government could implement mitigation strategies and pass legislation to help deal with the pandemic in a sustainable way. That includes building infrastructure, funding the proper resources, and distributing the proper resources like masks and guidance to the general public. But that didn't happen. They kind of just kept extending lockdowns more and more until a vaccine came out, which was not an ideal strategy.
But the other obviously glaring possibility is that injecting billions of people with a vaccine that was not tested by any stretch of the imagination with the thoroughness that it should have before it was forced upon people also might be a contributing factor, partly because we know that it led to a rise in myocarditis among young men.
All right, I'm gonna stop Jordan right there. So, no. A lot of people think that because it was rolled out so fast that steps were skipped in testing, but really they weren't. Normally when I hear this from people like Jordan, I ask them, well, what steps were skipped? What experiments were not done that you wanted to see done before it rolled out? And they usually can't answer, because this is just a talking point that people repeat. It went through phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, which are all human clinical trials that scale up in numbers as you go up in phases. And all those results were published and free to read to the public before the vaccines ever hit the market. And this myocarditis problem is one that people always bring up, but I've talked about it extensively on my channel. Essentially, you're more likely to get myocarditis from the virus, and when you get myocarditis from the virus, it is much more likely to be much more severe than what would happen following vaccination. There are plenty of studies showing that recovery from myocarditis following vaccination is quick and uneventful. That's not to say there aren't really, really rare severe cases, because that definitely did happen, but they are very few and far between, and we know a few tricks on how to prevent them from happening now. For example, we know that the highest risk for myocarditis in young men was occurring after the second shot of Moderna's mRNA vaccine. The rates were not as high with Pfizer's second dose of vaccine. But we also figured out that spreading out the time between the first and second dose really reduced your risk of developing myocarditis. So it's not like we ignored the problem. It was studied intensely, and it was still concluded that the risk-benefit profile heavily favors vaccination over not vaccinating. Because not only did COVID vaccination have a very low risk of myocarditis compared to getting infected without any immunity, but vaccination also reduced your risk of getting myocarditis if you do get infected with SARS-CoV-2. So it was all around just the much safer option, and I don't understand why you would ever not want to go with the safest option in anything. So yeah, Jordan Peterson so far seems to not be bringing any unique talking points, and I'm not sure he understands the claims he's actually making.
Absolutely no reason whatsoever to ever recommend that vaccine was delivered to young children whose risk of death at COVID was so close to zero that it might as well have been zero.
When you're talking about a disease, the risk of death isn't the only thing that you worry about for the disease. There's also
so you're talking about transmission?
No, that is... I hear so many people say that, and it's just so wrong. Children were not at zero risk from COVID. In the US, by the end of 2023, about 2,000 children under the age of 18 had died of COVID. That's a lot of children to die from an infectious disease, when children normally don't die from infectious diseases in developed nations. Most of those deaths were preventable because most of those deaths were in the unvaccinated. And Destiny is absolutely right there. There's more to infectious diseases than death. Just getting hospitalized due to infectious disease is a very scary, expensive, and emotionally taxing experience. I don't know about you, but I would want to avoid that if I could. And vaccination is a great way of preventing hospitalization in children.
The idea is that vaccines were supposed to help because it reduces your hospitalization, it reduces death, and it reduces transmission, hopefully by making it so that people don't get sick or don't get sick for as long. All three of those things the vaccines did exceedingly well. They continue to do that to this day, but especially for the first variant and then the Delta variant, the vaccines helped immensely here.
Yep, that's pretty much on target. Good job on Destiny there. I will just point out that the vaccines still do that really well for Omicron. It's just when it comes to infection and transmission, if you want big benefits from vaccination against Omicron, you're going to either have to have an updated booster or you have to have gotten 3 shots initially, and then your immune memory will expand its range such that it can encompass the very different Omicron variant. The immune mechanisms behind this are pretty cool. I've talked about them on my channel a lot before, but I'll link some papers describing them in the description below.
I think that is a completely acceptable, given that the disease itself is more likely to cause myocarditis or pericarditis.
Yes, I don't think the data suggests support that presupposition anymore. The latest peer-reviewed studies show that that's simply not true, especially among young men.
What study is he talking about? That is completely false.
And they jumped on the vaccine bandwagon in exactly the same way that you're doing right now.
Pharmaceutical companies have helped us tremendously throughout the...
Right, there we go. Fine. No,
think modern
I don't
medicine
think
hasn't?
so. No, I don't think so.
You're just wrong.
I think they're
You're
utterly
completely wrong.
icy.
Why is he yelling so much? Why is he so angry? He's like turning red. Look, this is just more lazy thinking here. I can totally understand having a basal level of distrust for pharmaceutical industries. There are plenty of valid reasons to have that. I mean, we all remember Martin Shkreli, the guy with the really punchable face, who price gouged very life-saving and necessary medications unnecessarily just to screw people over so that his company could make money. Pharmaceutical companies can do that sometimes, and it's very, very disgusting. But you have to acknowledge that they do produce life-saving medications. Without Big Pharma, you'd have no insulin, you'd have no antibiotics to fight infections that once were extremely deadly. You wouldn't have new life-saving cancer drugs. You wouldn't have drugs that make organ transplants possible. And we wouldn't have hope for future drugs that can address the diseases that none of us want to have. But I don't know, man. Jordan Peterson's just really angry right now. He seems like he would just throw all that out if he had the power to.
Do you think that we get effective drugs from pharmaceutical companies?
Not particularly.
Okay. Do you think that any vaccines work?
Yes.
Do you think that any...
I don't think 80 of them work.
What?
At once, for babies. I think that's a little risky.
Nobody does that. Nobody injects 80 vaccines all at once. Nobody even injects 80 vaccines within the first 18 years of life. What is he talking about? So I just recently went through this with both of my children, but the most doses that your child is going to get in a single pediatric visit is 5 or 6 doses. And trust me, your child encounters way more immune insults on a daily basis than 5 or 6. There are germs everywhere. Children are always putting things in their mouth. Children are always getting exposed to germs from other people. They can handle it. Anyway, by age 18, if you take all your childhood vaccinations and get a flu shot every single year, you'll have 56 doses of vaccines. So I don't know what the hell Jordan Peterson is talking about with this 80 number.
Because the left at least had been protected against the depredations of gigantic predatory corporations by their skepticism of the gigantic enterprises that can engage in regulatory capture, and that just vanished.
I feel like I keep listening to Jordan, and I keep looking for a point, and I just can't find one. He's so all over the place. Is this how he normally is?
Is it not possible that maybe people looked and they said, hey, if all the governments, all the institutions, all the schools, all the private companies across all the countries around the world are saying the same thing, maybe it is the case that this vaccine just helps. Is that not possible?
Oh, sure. Of course it's possible, but that didn't mean it was right.
Well,
they used force. They used force.
We use force for all sorts of things in terms of public health.
We don't generally use force to invade people's bodies.
We do, Jordan. History is very plentiful of those examples. And as Destiny points out, vaccine mandates have been a thing for a very long time. Back in the early 1900s, when smallpox was a thing in America, you would literally be forced at gunpoint to take smallpox vaccines. And that was pretty messed up, especially because there was a lot of racism and xenophobia, because immigrants were a lot of the people who actually had smallpox because they were being forced to live in very tight quarters in certain sections of cities, and they were working manual labor jobs where they were in close quarters with their fellow workers. Vaccine mandates have existed for a long time, and in several instances, they are actually beneficial. Not every instance, but there are instances where they are. Again, it's just intellectually lazy to say, we were forced, I don't like it. instead of looking at the data and making an informed decision on whether or not what you're saying has any merit whatsoever.
Was that we injected billions of people with an experimental, and it wasn't a bloody vaccine.
Of
Just
course
no, it wasn't.
Yes, it was.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It's
What,
not.
because it have a 100% success rate? You think it's a definition of vaccine? Well, the point of the vaccine is to give your body a protein
It's
to train
not
on
the
so that your
same
immune system works.
technology.
Who cares if it's not the same? There's
They
different
used
types
the word
of...
vaccine so that they didn't have to contend with the fact that it wasn't the same technology.
What is happening now? It's not a vaccine. Come on. A vaccine is something that is going to introduce your body to a weakened form of a pathogen or a piece of a pathogen so that your body can see that pathogen and train in how to fight it before it encounters the real thing. In other words, it's just something that's going to give your body an immune memory response against a particular infectious pathogen. And that's what mRNA vaccines do. I'm sorry, Jordan, but I don't know what you think a vaccine is, but that's what they do. They very efficiently produce B and T cell memories in people that can robustly be activated upon infection to fight the pathogen that it's meant to fight.
And it's bad in principle to inject billions of people with an untested new technology.
Isn't it also bad in principle for billions of people to get infected with a worldwide pandemic that initially was causing a decent number of deaths, a ton of complications, shutting down world economies?
Maybe it was.
I don't know what's happening right now. Jordan just seems totally unprepared here.
So shouldn't we be able to
looks like-
engage in that analysis and figure out, like, if we look at the
We're
side
not
effects of the
engaging
vaccine-
in the analysis.
No, because now we're talking about whether or not
pretending that nothing
vaccines are even
happened.
vaccines or not instead.
No, don't play that game. That is not what I was doing. I was making a very specific and careful case.
He's so angry. And, okay, he's saying he's making a very clear and specific case. So hopefully he does that for the first time in this video.
The mRNA technology, by wide recognition, is an extraordinarily novel technology. And you
That doesn't
can
make
call
it not a vaccine, though.
Well, okay, it's a radically transformed form of vaccine. I don't
We
give a
make
damn.
updates.
That still makes it something so new that the potential danger of its mass administration was highly probable to be at least or more dangerous than the thing that it was supposed to protect against. And we are seeing that in the
We
excess
are
deaths.
absolutely not saying. So are you implying now that the excess deaths were caused by the vaccines? Or
I
it
don't.
sounds like
I don't bloody well know what they're
that's what you're
caused by.
implying now.
Well, look,
I mean, on what basis is he saying that there was a high probability that the vaccine was going to be worse than the virus? What is convincing him of that? I don't understand. And Destiny said the right thing, I think. He said, shouldn't we be engaging in the analysis of whether or not that's true? And Jordan says we're not engaging in that analysis, but we absolutely are. Phase 4 safety monitoring is a thing that is ongoing, and it's going to keep going forever because you constantly monitor any drug for safety events after it is rolled out. The reason being because you are only going to detect rare side effects that are, say, 1 in a million once it rolls out to millions of people. In clinical trials, you only have about 40,000 people at most involved in your clinical trial, and about half of them are going to get the drug. You're not going to see a 1 in a million event in that data set with statistical significance. So you have to monitor after it's rolled out, and the US alone has several different systems dedicated to just that, and they regularly publish data on what they're finding. And not only do all of those systems within the US agree that COVID vaccines have a favorable risk-benefit profile, but every system all over the world that does the same thing and is completely independent of what the US does agrees. So in order to believe what people like Jordan say, you have to believe that there is a massive worldwide conspiracy to hide all of these negative effects and hide all of these deaths. But Jordan just instead, again, is going with this intellectually lazy approach. And I keep saying that, but it keeps showing itself in this conversation.
Why wouldn't Putin? Why wouldn't Xi Jinping? Why wouldn't anybody else in the world call this out? It was as horrible as it was.
there are plenty of people attempting to call
Nobody
out that-
credible and no huge institution.
What do you make of the excess deaths? You haven't come up with a bloody hypothesis.
I don't even know if there are 20% at the excess deaths in Europe right now. If I had to guess,
This is so weird. He just goes back to the excess deaths. Like, that's all he has, I guess. So we don't see it on a population level. We don't see it on a clinical trial level. We don't see it on a large observational study level. Why would we think that vaccines are causing excess deaths, Jordan? I just want one reason. I just want one bit of evidence, one convincing argument that we should think that vaccines are causing excess deaths instead of him just going, what about the excess deaths?
And what do you make of the VAERS data? There's more negative side effects reported from the mRNA vaccines than there were reported for every single vaccine ever created since the dawn of time. And not by a small margin. So it's not just the excess deaths.
I agree.
It's the VAERS data.
What is VAERS data?
It's the database that until the COVID-19 pandemic emerged and we had the unfortunate consequence that there were so many side effects being reported, it was the gold standard for determining whether or not vaccines were safe. No. And now as soon as it started to misbehave on the mRNA vaccine front, we decided that we were going to doubt the validity of the VAERS reporting system.
Okay. All right. No. Man, these talking points, they just keep coming and they don't stop coming. VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is a passive reporting system where anybody can report any event that happened to them or somebody else following a vaccine. The VAERS website itself has instructions on how to use and interpret these data, which I guess Jordan Peterson didn't bother to read. But it explains that events reported to the VAERS system are not necessarily causal. They are just temporally associated. And because COVID was such a huge life event, and because the COVID vaccine was also such a huge event, there was a lot more awareness to VAERS, including among healthcare professionals. So with millions of people getting vaccinated in a single day, there are a lot of events getting reported to VAERS. In fact, if we just take a moment to look at the kinds of events that drastically increased in their reporting to VAERS following the COVID vaccine rollout, they include things like dog bites, feelings of anxiety, and lots of other things, including this. And yes, this all sounds really silly, I know. And the fact that it sounds silly is what makes people like Jordan Peterson say, oh, we just threw out VAERS when COVID vaccines came around, and it used to be the gold standard. Like, no, none of that's true. It never used to be the gold standard. What it is a passive reporting system that we use to measure events that are happening following vaccination, and we use that data to look for trends in specific things. Once a signal is identified using a system like VAERS, further research is then undertaken to confirm or deny it as a true causative signal of the vaccines. And there are plenty of examples of this throughout the pandemic. The adenovirus vector vaccines that were produced by Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca had a very rare side effect of blood clotting, and that signal was initially caught in VAERS, and then further research confirmed that as a real signal. The same thing happened with the rare cases of myocarditis following mRNA vaccines. There were also several other signals that didn't pan out as real signals, such as strokes following mRNA vaccines. And there are several studies that were published using VAERS data showing that when you look at the rates of events reported to VAERS compared with the rates of expected events that would happen in the population if you just gave them a glass of water, then the rates were no different. For example, this study looked at the rates of deaths reported to VAERS and even looked at death certificates and autopsy results and tried to determine if the rates of these deaths or the causes of these deaths were unusual in the population compared to base rates of all of these events. Base rates being rates that were measured before the COVID vaccine rollout. And they found that there were no unusual patterns of death. Again, these results agree with several other studies from several other institutions from all over the world, all saying the same thing. Okay, we got onto and off of the VAERS crazy train. What is next? I can only imagine.
All VAERS is I might go and get a vaccine, and maybe in 3 days I go, I got a headache. I'm going to go ahead and call my doctor and make this report. And they'll say, okay, well, it's an adverse event after vaccine. Doesn't mean the vaccine caused the headache. And now that more people know about this system than ever.
I'm saying that
VAERS is not the gold standard of determining if a vaccine is working or not.
What?
Compared to actual longitudinal, perspective, randomized controlled trial
studies. You mean like the ones they should have done to the goddamn vaccines?
Like the ones that they did do for the vaccines and they continue to do to this day. Yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, see, so, I mean, Destiny is not an expert in this either. He's not a scientist, but he's getting the points generally right. Like, he's hitting all the things that I just said. And I promise I did not watch that segment before I said what I just said.
That you're in a position to evaluate the scientific credibility of the trials for the vaccines, do you?
No,
Really?
I don't. So I have to trust.
Then what are you
what
doing?
I have to do. What
I don't trust
I
them.
have to
I looked
trust
at the bloody data.
First of all, you have to trust third parties to some extent.
He clearly did not look at any data. Jordan, what data have you looked at? I'm dying to know, because you're getting everything wrong. I mean, of course you trust consensus. If you go to a city you've never been to before and you want to know where to eat, you're gonna put some trust in the consensus of the reviews online. And you're probably going to trust the opinion of chefs or food critics over the opinion of the guy who thinks that Taco Bell is authentic Mexican food. This is just an insane take to say you don't trust experts.
Trust. We have to trust third-party institutions to make
Except when they
determination.
use force. How about that?
Especially when they use force. We trust the police officers. We trust the
We
judicial
do, Abe.
It always goes back to the mandates. It always goes back to force. See, this is what I mean. It's intellectually lazy. He's not interested in evaluating the data for himself to see if his beliefs actually check out. He's not interested in challenging his beliefs with the data to better his perspective or better his conclusions and make them more aligned with reality. He doesn't seem to care about any of that. All right, well, I watched a little bit more of this, and it looks like they start to veer off into other topics that I'm not interested in touching. So, wow. I think I said pretty much everything I want to say about this interview. It's just wild to me that people like Jordan Peterson have so much influence and people value their opinions so much when they don't seem to even do the bare minimum to research. At least in this instance, he is literally just repeating talking points, and I don't think he's done an ounce of thinking about them. All right, well, anyway, that's going to do it for this week's video. That was certainly fun. I very much enjoyed watching that. I hope you enjoyed watching this video too. And as always, all of the links to all of the science that I talk about in this video are in the description below. So be sure to check those out if you want to be not like Jordan Peterson and actually learn about these topics before you talk about them. And of course, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to subscribe so that you can catch me next week where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.